So you've already heard this evening that our Torah portion is go to Pharaoh. And we're just 3 portions into the book of Exodus, and we're already at the moments that we remember and read in the Haggadah every year. And in this Torah portion, we read of the last 3 plagues, one of which Rabbi Greenstein spoke about, of locusts, darkness, and the death of the firstborn. And it's that final one that finally breaks Pharaoh, enough for the Israelites to be freed. So when this week's Torah portion ends, as Rabbi Greenstein also said, next week we have Michamocha, when they finally reach that moment of freedom. But this week's Torah portion ends with the moment where they are packing their things and getting ready to go. They've gotten the words, "You are free, you may go," but they haven't actually gotten to freedom yet. And so, not yet across the Sea of Reeds, there may not have been time for the reality of freedom to set in just yet. They were leaving Egypt behind, not yet knowing what they were headed toward. And who knows what they imagine the promised land to be like? They don't yet know that they're not going to be allowed to make it in, because God will decree that pretty soon after this. But at this moment, they think that they're headed to the land of milk and honey, to the promised land. And who knows what they would think it would be like. It's safe to say they probably could not have fathomed the modern state as it exists today, mostly just because I think modernity would be a huge shock in general. I often also wonder if Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, could have even fathomed the state of Israel as it is today. This is an exercise we've done with some of our religious school classes over the years. We hand them paper and pens and not much else and ask, if you were to create a Jewish state or country, what values would you use to guide it? I hope 9th grade will talk about this later at the Shabbat dinner table. What laws would you choose? Which values would be your most central guiding principles? We imagine building a Jewish utopia, truly an or lagoyim, a light unto the nations as Israel is supposed to be. And sometimes we feel that the modern state of Israel has succeeded in doing so. From a distance, Israel at times does seem like a Jewish utopia. It's a safe haven for Jews whose lives are threatened because of their religion anywhere in the world. It is a country that lives on Jewish time. You don't have to ask off for the high holidays. It's a place where strangers will go out of their way to help you. We can look at pictures of the beautiful colors of all the fruits and vegetables in the shuk. We can imagine the quietness of Shabbat when you're in a place where most people are observing it. We think about the beauty of the land and so much more. And I also imagine that the conversation between Israel's founders was much more involved than the classroom discussions I mentioned earlier. But I do believe they wrote a beautiful and inspiring document with Israel's Declaration of Independence. It reads in part, "The state of Israel will promote the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace taught by the Hebrew prophets. It will uphold the full social and political equality of all its citizens without distinction of race, creed, or sex. It will guarantee full freedom of conscience, worship, education, and culture. It will safeguard the sanctity and inviolability of shrines and holy places of all religions, and will dedicate itself to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations." They wrote a beautiful document. With these words and values at its center, we would hope that Israel would live up to them. Though we know all too well, even with resolutions or commitments we make in just our own lives, let alone a whole country, we often fall short of the ideal. When I first read these words from Israel's Declaration of Independence as a young person, I remember being so proud of what Israel stood for. Look at what the Jewish people built. At the time, I had never been to Israel, but I loved Israel. I'm not even sure I had met an Israeli yet. And so it was easy to hold Israel to that ideal, to imagine that it was this perfect, beautiful Jewish Disneyland. I don't even know how I imagined it. And it wasn't until a few years after that that I encountered a different side of Israel. I was very fortunate to visit as a very enthusiastic 16-year-old on my Nifty in Israel trip. And immediately I was hooked on the Holy Land, fascinated by Judaism, and committed to continue the connection with both Judaism and Israel. And arguably, that trip was one of the many moments that led me to become a rabbi, to be able to stand here in front of you all today. And that's why I was devastated to learn that according to the state of Israel, I am not Jewish. You can imagine my shock as a teenager. After all, I was raised in a house with 2 Jewish parents. I grew up going to synagogue. I grew up attending religious school, participating in youth group, spending every summer at Jewish overnight camp, and of course, traveling to Israel the first chance I had. So how could this be? How could someone tell me, who was on a trip to Israel with their Jewish youth movement as a 16-year-old, that I wasn't even Jewish? It's because in Israel, there's no separation of church and state, or synagogue and state, if you prefer. Therefore, the rabbinut, the chief rabbinate, is a particular brand of Orthodox and only recognizes a particular brand of Judaism. You see, according to the rabbinut in Israel, because my mother converted through our Reform synagogue in Kansas City, yes, before my birth, I was not considered Jewish because she wasn't considered Jewish, because she hadn't converted with an approved Orthodox rabbi. I was furious. I was offended. And honestly, 20 years later, after hearing that news, I continue to be so, because that's still the law in Israel today. I thought as a 16-year-old things might change more quickly. But this moment in my life was one in which I learned that it's one thing to put words on papers and to write guiding values and to write these founding documents of the state of Israel, but it's quite another to turn those words into laws or apply them to everyday life in a way that really upholds those values. So at that moment, I also learned that you're awake now. In that moment. But in the moment I was referring to, I also learned that I didn't have to accept someone else's definition of me, nor did I have to stop loving Israel. Just because Israel wasn't living her values yet didn't mean she never would. So when I moved to Israel for my first year of rabbinical school, I connected with Women of the Wall, an organization that I hope is familiar to many of you because it is part of the Israel Religious Action Center, whose executive director, Anat Hoffman, was here 2 years ago, something like that, has been here many times over the years. But it's an initiative that meets on Rosh Chodesh, the first day of every Hebrew month, to pray at the Kotel, at the Western Wall. And while that doesn't sound like that much of a radical act, it's a radical act because the Kotel, as many of you know from hearing her speak here, is controlled by an ultra-Orthodox group. And so that means that women are not supposed to pray loudly, women are not supposed to wear talit, women are not supposed to wear kippot, women are not supposed to wear tefillin, and certainly they are not supposed to raise their voices in prayers loud enough so the men on the other side of the mechitza, the divider between male and female, while they're praying. And so, and women are also not allowed to read from the Torah at the wall. And yet, at this service, women and their allies meet to do all of those things, to pray the way they would in their own communities. During my time praying with the women of the wall, there were times where we sang prayers so passionately, so loudly, that we couldn't even hear the angry ultra-Orthodox men screaming from across the mechitza. But in the moments that we could hear them, they yelled some of the most disgusting, hateful things I have ever heard a person say to another person, let alone a Jew to another Jew. They shouted things like, and I quote, 6 million died because of you. You are worse than Nazis. While we were trying to pray. They threw chairs over the mechitza toward us. They threw raw eggs. All of this because a group of women with their friends wanted to, for one service a month, they're not going there every day to do this. They pick once a month, 12 times a year, 13 in a leap year, to be able to pray the way they could at their synagogue at the holiest site in Israel. And you may also know that members of this group are often arrested for bringing a Torah to the women's side of the Kotel. And I bring all of this up to ask the question, what if Israel was the place where it wasn't the woman holding a Torah that was arrested, having a Torah ripped out of her hands, but instead it was the man throwing a raw egg and a chair over a mechitza while a woman sang the same prayers we sing here tonight? That's not what Israel looks like right now. The woman holding the Torah is the one who gets arrested. So this is just one example of the many ways in which the state of Israel disenfranchises our movement, the Reform movement in Israel. And as I said, if you've been at Temple Israel over the last many years, probably decades, you've heard our rabbis as well as guest speakers such as Anat Hoffman, who I mentioned, who's the executive director of the Israel Religious Action Center, or Rabbi Josh Weinberg, who was here in November, talk about the need for religious pluralism in Israel. That for Israel to be a homeland of the Jewish people, it needs to be a home for all Jews, no matter how they pray or who they pray with or what they wear while they pray. We've spoken about the injustice of not being a recognized movement of Judaism in Israel, the implications of which mean that we are often denied egalitarian prayer spaces, as I explained, especially at our holiest sites, that our Israeli Reform colleagues historically have not been supported through state funds as every recognized Orthodox institution, let alone Christian and Muslim institutions. So all religions receive money, government funding from the state of Israel, except the Jewish Progressive Movement. Non-Orthodox rabbis are not able to conduct legal wedding ceremonies in Israel, nor burials. Much of this you've heard before. And in Israel, like my mother, anyone who did not convert to Judaism with an approved Orthodox rabbi is not considered Jewish, nor is anyone who has one Jewish parent if that parent happens to be the father. These are not our values. This is not our Israel. So rarely in life are we given exact directions of what to do to make a difference. We become overwhelmed by all the injustice of the world and feel completely powerless in the face of the fight ahead, and we just get angry. In this instance, I am happy to tell you there is something you can do, something that is concrete with direct results that supports our values. It is election season for the Jewish people, and you should be very excited to know that our election cycle is really short. Voting started January 21st and it ends March 11th, and you probably didn't hear a lot about it many months before. This isn't going on for years. This is an election that happens once every 5 years. And so voting is open now, as I said, and continues through March 11th, and hopefully you've received our emails or a postcard that looks similarly to this. This is actually an image of Women of the Wall that I just spoke about that has the exact instructions of how to vote. And if you're not familiar, check out our website, talk to me or any of our clergy after the service as well. We're happy to point you in that direction. But I just, out of curiosity, who has already voted? Excellent. Who's intending to vote? Hooray. So, again, the World Zionist Congress has 500 seats. 190 are elected in Israel, 145 from the US, and 165 from the rest of the world. So the United States Jewish community has a huge amount of delegates on this Congress. And this is a Congress that has existed since 1897 when Theodore Herzl founded it. And every Jew over the age of 18 is eligible to vote. And this little asterisk here lets you know that there is a minimal fee to process your online vote, so you're not surprised. But this is important to our movement because the World Zionist Congress makes decisions that impact Israeli society and where financial and other resources are sent, including to which Jewish movements or organizations. So a lot of the things I spoke about tonight, the World Zionist Congress can make decisions that help make sure that Israel is a state for all Jews and not just Orthodox. Since the last World Zionist Congress election 5 years ago, did I mention they only happen once every 5 years, so this is a big deal, our movement rocked the vote and landed us 56 delegates out of that 500. Their hard work and dedication resulted in getting $4 million a year being directed to the Israeli Reform movement. If that sounds like a lot of money to you, $4 million a year, by comparison, the Israeli government annually provides $1.1 billion to Orthodox and Haredi institutions. $4 million to the Israeli Reform movement, and that's progress, and $1.1 billion to the Orthodox and Haredi. We're not saying that different denominations don't deserve funding also, just that we would like funding equal to our representation as well. And so if that wasn't enough, your vote for the Reform Movement slate, which is slate number 2, if you're ever confused on it's a very complicated process of voting, but it could place our very own Rabbi Micah Greenstein on the World Zionist Congress. He is listed as a member on the delegation, and so depending on how many spots we get on it, he could represent our values literally in Israel on the World Zionist Congress, which I can't imagine a better representative for us here at Temple and for Reform Judaism in America. So we've committed to 500 votes, and so I hope that if you haven't already voted, that you will. You still have until March 11th, and if you have, thank you so much for reading your emails or looking in your mail. And so if you're wondering what the Reform slate stands for the World Zionist Congress, Do you believe in religious equality in Israel? If the answer is yes, vote the reform slate. Vote number 2. Do you believe in combating racism, discrimination, and hatred in Israel? Then vote reform. Do you believe in the pursuit of peace, security, and stability for the region? Guess what? So does the reform movement slate for the World Zionist Congress. Unlike the Israelites who were freed from Egypt, who didn't know what the land of their own could look like, we know what a land of our own does look like. Our home, our homeland, it's ours. And not only that, but we have the agency to help build a country and continue to build this country, even from across our seats in the ocean, that lives up to the values it espouses. All of this is from a place of love. We love Israel, and we just want her to live her values. So help us get one step further by casting your vote for the Reformed Jewish values in the World Zionist Congress elections. And Bo, go get it done. Do it now. Shabbat shalom.